Yeah, we've got a few minutes.
Yeah, I'm gonna go do anything.
How's everyone doing?
Good. It's been a Zoom-filled day.
Yeah.
How many have you guys been on? At least 3, 4? 3.
Since I got here this morning.
Call as well. It's weird being on a phone call though when you're so used to Zoom, you know, like an actual phone call. You're like, oh, this person can't see me and I'm right.
On mine, we talked about being on Zoom. I'm like, this is sad. Like, it's a phone call. We're like, well, if it was Zoom, we're like, oh.
We can see each other.
Yeah, I think I've only been on 3 today.
I guess that's not too bad, right?
Plus a couple phone calls.
I was in a Zoom session yesterday where the host had turned off the ability to see a list of participants, and we couldn't do video either, and it was so disorienting to just have a
weird
presentation.
Yeah,
that is odd. Yeah.
Does anyone know why Zoom, the CEO of Zoom, why he started Zoom?
No.
He started Zoom because he had a long distance relationship with his girlfriend and he wanted to be able to see her.
Oh,
so billions of dollars later.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and so he uses it a lot now because he has more time with his family and all those other things. Other like, you know, the other thing that was started just to get back at a girlfriend. He actually started to have a relationship with his girlfriend. I'll just say that. I won't call any names, but I think everybody knows who that is. Yeah, it was interesting just reading about him because he, you know, I guess between March and maybe June, he earned about $15 billion.
Wow.
Yeah.
Say that again? B?
Billions, yes.
Oh my gosh.
I heard that Jeff Bezos has made so much in the past 10 months that he could give every one of the employees in Amazon over $100,000 and still have more wealth than he had in the beginning.
Yeah,
that's
well,
too much money, isn't it?
Yeah, his ex-wife has done marvelous things for historic Black colleges. She's just been giving money away, and even to the I think she gave a local the local YWCA in Troy. She gave them $1 million.
Yeah, the YMCA also, I think she gave 5.
She gave 5, but the YWCA, which of course vice president, she gave 1 million, and so. You know, it's interesting that where the money goes.
And she gave a lot to the United Way too.
Yeah, she did. But there was no application process, or she just gave the money, which was really amazing. Morgan State, which is one of the historical Black colleges, she gave a lot of money to. So again, you know. Yeah, that's kind of awful to hear that he could do that with his employees and you have them barely making minimum wage.
Yeah, if that, yeah.
All right, here comes Deirdre.
Oh, great.
Oh. We're all going to be silent when she comes in like, hi.
A celebrity.
We haven't seen Dave yet.
Hello.
Hi,
sorry I was late there. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much
for coming.
Yeah.
That's good.
You look just like your mother.
Oh, yeah. Really? Who knows? Somebody know my mother?
I know your mother.
I
know your grandmother. I know your grandmother, Jean.
Of course. Oh my God, what a lovely surprise.
Yeah, my mother and your grandmother grew up together in New York.
Oh my God.
And your mom used to come and stay, your mother used to come and stay summers at my house.
Oh my God. I can't believe it.
And the reason I knew about your book. Yeah, the reason I knew about your book is because I called your mother like out of the blue 2 months ago. And I was telling her, you know, retired and what I'm going to be doing and everything. She said, you love my daughter's book. And so I got your book and I do love it.
Oh, I'm delighted.
I knew her as Deirdre Mask.
Yes, of course,
Yeah,
her maiden name,
so, I
exactly,
mean,
and
she used
Jean
to
Vance.
get up, and it's yeah,
Oh my
yeah,
God! And of
and
course,
she
she makes
used
brief
to,
appearances.
she does, because she has there was a guy whose mother wanted her to be her daughter-in-law. And that was Mrs. Carey. And your mother still stays in touch with Mrs. Carey in Philadelphia.
Oh my gosh, it's such a small world. Well, thank you so much for coming.
Oh,
I can't wait to talk
absolutely.
to her. I'm going to call her just after this. So thank
Yeah.
you.
So it was Ingram was the last name at that time.
I will tell her. Oh, she'll be delighted to call my grandmother as well.
Yeah,
But what a wonderful opening. That's as good an introduction as any.
Yeah, you look just like her. Oh
I do look a lot like my mother. I know, the older I get as well.
Oh my gosh,
Wow.
you look just like her. That's so funny.
Oh, brilliant. Well, thank you so much. Wow, that's the best opening I've had of any of these that I've done so far. So
have you done a lot of them, Deirdre?
I have. I mean, some bigger groups and some smaller groups, but as you'll see, I can talk about this stuff all day. So, so sometimes it's just a few. I did one for a few. Actually, it was really interesting for some military wives in. It was a military wives book club. So they were all at different places. They had all met on a base in North Carolina. And one was in Bahrain, a couple were in Germany, one was in Korea. And they had really interesting insights because they'd lived all over the world. So they had all these different ideas of places and cities and space. And the Middle East is really interesting, which I don't talk about in the book as much. But the Middle East has a very complicated relationship with street addresses that I don't really get into in the book. So they had some interesting thoughts about that too. So yeah.
Excellent.
Yes, and thanks so much, Kim, for contacting me and choosing the book. This is great.
Well, I don't know if you guys know, but I originally reached out to Deirdre to see, can you provide us a quote or something? Yeah. And she was like, I'll come. I was like,
oh my God, I love this. Exactly. My husband's delighted because he doesn't have to talk to me about all this stuff, and my parents and everybody else. So I'm always excited to talk to people.
Oh, well, we really appreciate having you here.
Gosh, it's no problem.
And we've really loved discussing your book.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, that's great.
Sort of felt like we've been all over the world discussing it, you know. Have you been to Albany or the Capital Region before?
I'm trying to think. I took the bar exam in Albany. So, because that sort of doesn't really come out in the book, but I have a legal background by nature. So I don't know Albany well besides that one trip, but I passed.
Oh,
so I guess I
have an association with it.
So I lived in New York for a few years, and obviously, as Deborah was describing, my mother's from New York,
right?
And so I think I've always had a positive relationship with the state. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, I guess that will lead me into I'll just do a quick bio, and then we obviously want to get talking with some of the questions because we've got
absolutely
time. So, I mean, we've obviously all read your book, but just to give a quick bio, Deirdre is a lawyer, a writer, and sometimes academic, she says.
Yeah.
Work has appeared in The Atlantic, The Guardian, The New York Times, The Economist, Literary Hub, the Harvard Law Review, the New Hibernia Review, the Dublin Review, and the Irish Pages. Her book about street addresses came out in April of 2020. Yep. She is originally from North Carolina and lives in London now with her husband and daughters.
Yes, exactly. Who are thankfully asleep right now, so it's perfect time.
Well, it's so late.
No, this is great. I don't know if anybody else here has found this, especially if anybody has kids. This is like my working hours, so I sort of do the second shift. So this is actually perfect energy time for me because it's actually when I start to get things done. So in the pandemic with no school on and the like. So.
Perfect. That makes complete sense. I think a lot of us are in that boat.
Yes.
Would you like to? I sent you some of the questions. Could we work through them and then
we could dive into those? Yeah. Great.
Yeah,
and people should feel free to pitch in and ask me to explain. I always get something new. In fact, I always feel like, I wish I could rewrite the book now after I have these conversations because people always bring up these insights and have questions I can't quite answer. Yeah. Oh, good. Well, excellent. So I'll have to write. There's lots, as I was talking about, even in the intro about the Middle East, so much that I sort of didn't get a chance to talk about. So so it's exciting to be able to share this after the book is done. It doesn't feel like it's quite done in that way.
Excellent. Sorry, I'm just putting up the questions now.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with after all the places you've researched for your book, which city or country do you think has one of the best layouts and designs, and why?
Oh God, that was such a tricky one when I read it. And I think I have to answer it with almost a bit of a dodge and it kind of explains a bit about the book actually. And I tried really hard when I was doing the book not to take sides in particular, not to say necessarily my personal views. Now, obviously that's not necessarily true. Like there were some chapters where, I wasn't going to be neutral on Berlin or even the Confederacy, but in trying to decide city design, I did try to say neutral. And I think there really is that they're the best signs for certain places. So New York, for example, is a great example. And I think a lot of people, obviously you guys are in New York, you will Manhattan. I mean, there's something so beautiful about the grid, right? Like that was actually the most fun chapter for me to write because it wasn't something I'd ever thought about, but there's something so democratic about it. There's something so easy about it. I have the point about you never look like a tourist in New York. You can just kind of stride through. And that really suits the vibe of New York, that everybody's there, that it's this place of outsiders, that they sort of come in and that we can all have this democratic, very easily to parcel, easy to build, easy to tear down. Obviously, Manhattan was made by the grid, really. But then I start to think, oh, is that the best one? Because I'll think of London, where I live. And Kim probably knows well as well, where it's all lanes and alleys and crossing. People are very neighborhood oriented. They have their neighborhood, they have their spot and their pub, and things are hard to find. And the street names, as I say, my UK publisher is on a street I always love going to. It's called Cloth Fair. That's just the street name, Cloth Fair, because there was some medieval cloth fair there where you'd buy. And there's something so English about that as well, because you get so much English history and style of these pubs and these lanes. It seems very English. So I think, for London, this is the best city design. But then I think that begs the question, do we make our cities or do our cities make us? If New York had stayed this Dutch winding alleyway, would they be much more like the way I'm describing London? And the same thing, if London, after the fire, if many planners had done what they wanted to do, which was to basically grid it, would London be different? So it's a hard question, but I mean, there are some that I think people now recognize are just bad. I talk about Jersey City has a lot of issues in the way that they sort of did their grid. Utah, for example, a lot of people talk about Salt Lake City's grid. It's the blocks are very long, which I think makes it a bit bleak and not very walkable. Whereas Portland has quite small blocks, and people often say this makes it a more community because you have more of those intersections. It's easier to walk. You don't have to walk 20 minutes to get to the next intersection. So I think there is a lot of good examples of bad city design, but in terms of the best, I think it really depends on the culture of the people who live. Yeah.
Very democratic answer as well. So
yes, exactly. It's a good dodge.
Yeah, I like that. We have our next question. Do you agree with historian James Grossman's statement? These statutes were meant to create legitimate garb for white supremacy. Do you see this as part of the argument for reparations? And if so, what would you suggest would be the proper forum to address these issues?
Oh God, that's such a hard question. I mean, the first part is easy. I absolutely agree with James Grossman, who's sort of a historian. And I think the reason that makes it so obvious is the times that these statues and street names, for example, in Hollywood were at times of high racial friction. These weren't statues that were put up right after the Civil War to honor the recent dead. In almost no cases is that actually true. Right. These were statues that were put up around the 20s, when the KKK was on the rise, and later in the 40s and 50s during the Civil War. There were recently a monument that I was reading about that was put up in 1993. These are not the same idea that we have of the Tomb of the Fallen Soldier. And after, this isn't that, and they're put specifically in places designed to sort of trigger this kind of racial disharmony. So that part I absolutely agree with. I think they were samples. I mean, the reparations question is a really tricky one. I mean, we've seen situations where it's worked, and Germany gave massive reparations to Israel, for example. But it's a tricky question of how that would work and what that would look like. And I think one of the things that I tried to emphasize in my book without making necessarily prescriptive ideas is that one of the reasons why I think talking about these things like street names and monuments, which is easier to talk about than something like reparations, does get us talking. And I think I like these arguments. Like, I'm glad these things come to city councils, that people stand up and they argue about them and they have rallies and arguments and fights over them, because I think it actually gets us talking about them in a meaningful way. So, so in what form reparations would take, I mean, I think there are historical examples, and Ta-Nehisi Coates has written really well about it. But yeah, no, that's sort of out of my wheelhouse in terms of my area of expertise. But I think it's going to be something that's probably going to come up a lot. And I think starting with these monuments and these street names, or at least talking about them and exploring what they mean, is probably a necessary first step for whatever happens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I just realized as well that hi David, sorry I didn't see you.
Yeah.
Discussions recently as well, so I just wanted to introduce you to him as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, hi David. Sorry, I have people on two screens.
Oh yes, got it.
Excellent. Okay. Let me have a look. Sorry, it's on a separate thing. Question for Deirdre. Is there something you discovered during the process of researching and writing this book that surprised you?
Oh, there was so much that surprised me. Oh gosh, sorry, I should have thought of that one so quickly, because I think probably as it comes across from the enthusiasm on the page, everything described me. Everything surprised me. I was constantly being, blown away by these statistics. I mean, definitely the stuff that's in the book, the things that, and again, I think that's why the grid chapter was the most fun. How much the grid and the organization of American cities reflected American democratic ideals. And again, these sort of, it turned out to be quite Quaker and quite rebellious ideals. I thought was quite beautiful. There's something about that was really neat. In terms of things that didn't necessarily make it into the book that I could add to that conversation was, for example, I thought about writing a chapter on Israel, which I didn't end up writing about, mostly because I really felt like I had to go there, and at the time I just couldn't. But Israel is a good example of street names. So so there's a lot of research about how, for example, I don't know if people know Israel, but how Tel Aviv was founded. It's actually this really beautiful story. And I say this, taking away the political language about how you feel about these things, about how the city of Tel Aviv, at least as far as the settlers saw it, is how it founded. Basically, they're on this beach. And they and there's like, I don't know, so a number of families who are the founding families of Tel Aviv, and they have they pick up two shells from the leader, and one shell represents their family, and one shell represents a plot of land. So that was randomly assigned, so that people wouldn't get arguments over what plot of land. And there's this really symbolic story to Tel Aviv that matches in with their street names. And so they started to have street names that reflected Jewish names, Jewish scholars and rabbis and artists, and you have all of these people like writing about how they would come from Europe to Israel and how much at peace and how much at home they felt in this land that had these street names in it. And it was really beautiful. And there's something very powerful about that kind of meaning and et cetera, like that. Now, and interestingly, the however you want to describe it, let's just call it this Palestine, doesn't for the most part have street addresses. And there have actually been Supreme Court cases in Israel about this, that they, that the Palestine should have street names and should have street addresses. And it's constantly a court battle. And this is very interesting because they want all of the resources that street addresses provide. So then it becomes sort of a power dynamic. But then there's even another layer on top of that, which is that for the most part, the Israelis, the Jewish Israelis, were coming from Europe, which had, as we know from the book, this commemorative street naming idea. They had this idea of street names and the way that street names could be used. So they brought this from Europe and they used it. And they used it as a way of defining it as the space and their values and their ideals, which was obviously extremely powerful for them after the war and having a place of belonging. But at the same time they denied it to other people,
right?
And the tussle over street names and what the names are and whether there should be names is something that really defines a way a lot of the Israeli politics work on. And there's this wonderful quote that I actually initially had in the book, but I couldn't quite verify it, so I didn't feel comfortable keeping it in. But there's this Arab, one of the Arab Supreme Court members said that on his way to the courthouse, he would purposely drive on a street named after a Jewish Israeli and a street named after an Arab Israeli, of which there are some, because he felt that there was something quite equal about doing that. He didn't just like driving down the thing. And I thought, again, none of this made it into the book, but to highlight that question in a way that adds something to the conversation, I thought that really exemplified a lot of the things I was talking about, about why street names matter, why dresses matter, how they can show all these different things. And it's not cut or dry. I mean, I'm not taking sides in that point. Actually, it's a very complicated story, obviously. So, yeah.
Well, I can't imagine how much then if you've got those amazing stories that didn't make it into the book.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I have so many of them. Yeah.
So this one is a little bit long, so bear with me. Will we always need addresses that can lodge in human memory and be conveyed orally? Or will GPS numerical specificity make this obsolete? With GPS, we gain a form of equal treatment and we eliminate historical and cultural inequalities. But what will we lose if those names go away?
Yeah, I think that is the question. And the answer is GPS is just going to become increasingly important. Deliveries are more important. I talk about it in terms of the last mile delivery. It's incredibly important to development. Right. And even the system they were using in India, the opening chapter is basically GPS. It's a certain technology, but they weren't trying to name the streets in the slums. And when you ask them, they're like, what do you think, we're crazy? What I mean? Like, no, we're not going to get into that. That's just, it was too much for them to take on. So they really were using GPS. I think GPS is here to stay. And as I talk about, there are these companies, including companies like Google and this What 3 Words company, that are really banking on the answer to that being yes, that we are one day going to recite our addresses differently. The interesting thing about it is that hasn't happened yet. I mean, a lot of these technologies and a lot of GPS has actually been around for a really long time. And a lot of what these companies are doing is, oh yeah, I hear that sound again. A lot of what these companies are doing is repackaging a lot of the GPS into a format that we can try to remember. So so you kind of have to take it with a, grain of salt. In theory, this should be possible, but there's a reason that we all cling to them. And there's also this idea that, we don't define ourselves by our individual GPS addresses. We define ourselves as the neighborhood. So it'd feel very strange if my address was 37957 and my neighbors was 17. There's nothing that shows that we're neighbors. And I think we quite like that. We quite like that connection. So I think the answer is surely at some point we are going to become more specifically when drones are delivering things to our windowsills or whatever. But it hasn't happened yet, and it doesn't seem likely to happen. It doesn't seem poised to happen anytime soon. But a lot of companies are banking on making a lot of money that it will.
Money into it. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
If we just ask everyone to mute, because we've got a bit of feedback from someone.
I hope it's not me. My internet was messing up earlier, but I don't see anything. That
I don't know.
Yeah.
Cara, I think you're the host now. Could you just mute everyone?
I'm terrible at all.
But I'm not gonna.
Everybody says like the 3 dots, and then you can click mute.
Okay, hold on. Let me see if I can mute everybody and then unmute you too.
Okay, great.
Okay, and then I think Deirdre and Deirdre, you can unmute
myself, and then I know if it's me. Okay, perfect. That seems to have solved it.
Perfect.
Great.
You did it.
Yeah. So just to what were we talking about there, Kim? My memories.
So
the what 3 words. So I mean, it'll be fun to watch. I mean, and one thing that the book doesn't really convey is how much of this is erased. I mean, I highlight what 3 words because they're such a colorful example of this. But there's a race for this. Every day I get some email from PR people talking about their new GPS way of describing. And at one point, one is going to stick. But we'll see which one and if it actually happens to subvert our own addresses. I don't know.
I love that they're contacting you. Like you're the woman in the
know. How did this happen in the world? Like, how did I become this part? As you read from my bio, there's absolutely nothing in my bio that would have led to me being the expert on addresses. But I'll take it. I mean, I'll absolutely take it.
Okay. How much time? Yes, we still got some time. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So they said this may be too down in the details, but I feel like you're a detail-oriented person, so I'm sure this won't bother you. I never really understood how someone in Japan would give you directions to give the block naming system. The book shows how a block is described in characters, but how does one give directions? Could Deirdre give us any?
It's incredibly difficult as far as I can understand. So, I think directions are given basically the same way we give directions, just without using the names. So, so the way your address works is you have a district address and you have your block address and you have your number. So the way that I understand it works is that if you read Japanese guides, say, for how to give direction, how to listen to and give directions, go straight to the next intersection, 2 intersections down. On the right is this ramen shop. I think it's much landmark based and also block based, like intersections and how many street lights and traffic lights. It's also more of a map culture. And again, some of this predates GPS, because if you talk to Japanese people now, they're like, well, when you're in a taxi cab, it's very easy to just give the GPS locator. It's not that difficult. It's easy for them to navigate that way now. But also, as the book briefly mentions, but it's actually a big cultural aspect of Japan, is koban, which are, I'm pronouncing that right, which are basically these tiny little police stations everywhere that have these really extensive maps. So you could always stop at a koban and tell you how to get there. But as far as I understand, it's a bit landmark based and number based. I mean, I imagine in your local neighborhood, you would actually know the block numbers. So maybe it's go past this block and go that, but it's not, it'd be like if giving street addresses in your, giving directions in your town without actually using the street names. That's as far as I understand it. But again, if you talk to people now, I think some of that thinking about directions is obsolete given the technology now. But there's a great scene, something I don't know if anybody's seen the movie Lost in Translation.
Yes,
there's a movie about. There's a great scene in there. And there was actually a deleted scene when I went back to look at the script that was about street addresses, about how often they were getting lost. And the theme of the movie is about how alienating in some way, how different they felt from this culture of Japan they were in. And there actually is a scene of Bill Murray looking at maps and trying to get somewhere and saying there are no addresses here, so it becomes sort of a metaphor for this disorientation they feel, which some people have called racist, but that's a totally different topic, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's like an art to knowing your way around a place,
Yes, absolutely.
That, I feel like if I ask someone for directions after one sentence, I stop listening and I just go,
yes. Yeah. Oh, I'm terrible. Yeah. No. I am a pure ancient Roman in my navigation. I'm looking for the smells and what I can see and what I can hear, because if you start telling me the directions, they're in one ear, out the other.
Yeah. Okay. This one was my question, actually. What's a simple starting point any governments could begin at to improve life in the cities for those who are most vulnerable to being overlooked?
Yeah. It's such a great question. And I think the key to the answer to that is that word overlooked, which comes up in the book in terms of, if you recall, talk a lot about this book called Seeing Like a State, which I think is the greatest metaphor, that, the state wants to see you so they can do things with you. And for the most part, we think of this as being really positive. I mean, you see this all the time in the pandemic. Like I'm trying to write something now about surveillance, for example, and about how we've been attuned to think of surveillance as being this bad thing, this like nebulous, terrible thing. Except when the WHO issues these things about public health surveillance, we now know what that means, that why we want to see people and be able to know where they are. And we see this as a positive thing. So the overlooked is part of the point, is just to look for them, to find them, because we measure things by what we count, right? We value what we count. We know how many $50 bills are in your pocket, but not how many pennies are in your pocket, right? So, so by counting people and seeing them, and then at least knowing what's happening. I know this happens all the time, and it happens in my head. We have these amorphous groups like the homeless or the poor or the immigrant, and we just don't really have a sense of actually what we're dealing with besides these amorphous groups. When you start counting people and locating them and understanding who these people are, it's actually a huge step towards making anything happen. So I guess just making sure people aren't overlooked, that we are looking for them and knowing who they are. And for example, there was an interesting study about the homeless, because the question highlighted that about the census and the homeless, and how dramatically undercounted the census is for homelessness, and that one of the ways that they count what they call in the UK rough sleepers, which would be people who are homeless in the traditional sense we think of. I mean, literally sleeping outside.
Sleeping rough, yeah.
Even though we know that a vast majority of homeless people aren't actually sleeping outside. They're keeping it on a friend's sofa, or sleeping in their car, going from shelter to shelter. at one point, it's so one of the ways the census counts is that they count. They send volunteers out to count how many homeless people, how many rough sleepers there are on one single day of the year. And it's like in January. Yeah. And what commentators have pointed out, I don't know how they do it in Albany, but what the commentators have pointed out is that that's the one time of the year when a lot of people will find a way to get some shelter.
Yeah.
NPR did a segment on that they couldn't do the counting this year.
Oh, right. There we go.
Because they put a bunch of people in a van and they go out. It was very sad to listen to it. Because
yes, I haven't heard that. I will look that up.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So they do. So not only do we have these structural problems, but I know at least New York City, they actually do something where they try to figure out what their undercount is of their homeless on this night. So they actually hire people to pretend to be homeless and later ask them, how many of you were counted by the census? And I think, they've estimated like a 20% undercount or something like that just through this. So not only is it structurally difficult to do this, it's the wrong time. And so the people think that the number of, and then also you're missing some people who are shifting locations constantly.
Yeah, of course.
That aren't going to be captured.
Yeah,
exactly. That aren't going to be captured in the census. So this issue, and it's hard not to see that as somewhat intentional or at least reckless, because there are ways that we could manage this. And a story that's come up in the UK recently. So I live in a borough called Hackney, which is a very mixed, very community. I mean, it's got to be one of the most diverse places, nations in the world. But interestingly, there was an article about how ethnic minorities here, as in the US, are more likely to decline the vaccine. And the UK is actually doing really well with the vaccine. So people were shocked that they were closing these centers early because they won't get the uptake. And there was some explanation for this, is that people have been made to feel so afraid of the government because the government has had so many anti-immigrant statements that they don't want to come forward for anything, not even for medical care. It's not just distrust of the government, but they want to hide, right? They don't want the seeing eye of the state in any way, even if it means getting a vaccine. And which is almost the opposite problem, because people actually don't want to be seen for like quite good reasons. I mean, some people are here, and so they've had to make these statements that registering with a doctor, with a GP, does not mean you're going to get deported, which should make sense, but actually isn't always intuitive to people, given that people are deported for other things that also seem quite neutral. It's the same in the US. I mean, it's a complicated story, but seeing people is hard. Seeing people, the people who need to be seen, seeing them can be really hard.
I think in that chapter you mentioned that it was 10% of the homeless were the chronically homeless. Everyone else were, they were chronic. And I never thought about that. That was a really
not something. Exactly. Not something I knew about at all, and I think it's in the book, but there was some statistic. I'm sure house prices in Albany are as crazy as they are every other place, that they were saying there's just no place in the world there's no place in America with a minimum wage you could afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And think how many single mothers there are out there who need a 2-bed. Literally, there wasn't a single county in America they found that you could do that. And so you start to realize how many people are using these makeshift systems. It was like the book, I don't know if anybody's read the book Evicted. From the Pulitzer, a few years ago, which for me was similarly eye-opening. It wasn't an issue that I thought about as much, about how many people are going from apartment to eviction to apartment to eviction to apartment to eviction, and this was just a cycle of life for people that I hadn't registered with. I'd been lucky enough not to experience it in my own life. So.
Yeah, that was actually, I think, on we in our reading list, we had added that book in as well, because it kind of linked really well with this, I thought, because it is that kind of, that cycle that people can get in. So we just had another question, this one from Bria. What is your next project, and will you be continuing with address-related topics?
Oh my gosh, I don't have an next topic, so I'm dying to know if anybody has any ideas. I'm interested in so many things, so I'm kind of waiting for that zeitgeist. Like I said, I'm writing a bit about surveillance at the minute. I'm very interested. Actually, you guys as a group, there's a really interesting story that's always fascinated me, that I was always trying to slip into this book, and then my husband and my editor kept saying, the story does not belong in this book. So the story is of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So we have Rousseau, the great French philosopher, And when he's writing in his confessions, the story about when he was an 8-year-old boy. So he's an 8-year-old boy and he's boarding with basically this tutor and his wife. And he's sitting in the kitchen alone. And on the table next to him are these combs, I guess hair combs. It's hard to just know. These hair combs that are sitting next to him drying. They've been washed. And when the lady of the house comes back, the teeth of the comb have been ripped out. So who did it? He was the only one in the room. Mm-hmm. He says he didn't do it. So he says, it wasn't me, it wasn't me. But as he acknowledges, who couldn't have been but him? He was the only one in the room. And so this becomes this, so he says this was the end of his childhood, because he said that until then, he thought that people could see him and understand him, that they could see straight into his heart, that they would know that he hadn't done this. And yet they don't. They think he did this, and eventually he's forced to leave this house. And so he writes, so he becomes obsessed with transparency. He becomes obsessed with this idea that if we could only see each other, if we were only transparent, if we could only see heart to heart, that everything would be perfect and everything would be fine. And it all stems back from this experience with him being wrongfully accused. Now, every time I talk about the story, my husband said, he totally did it. He says, obviously he's guilty. But it's such a good story. And I think it really, I don't know why I become completely obsessed with the story, because there's something about that. And this links into things I'm thinking about surveillance. So, and the book goes into this a bit, that we think again about surveillance as being this bad thing for good reasons. But the French and the revolutionaries, they had a very different idea of surveillance, kind of inspired in part by Rousseau, and that they saw it as a good thing. It wasn't that, the king was watching you, the king was surveilling you, or, for us, the president was watching you. It was that we were watching each other to make sure that we didn't mess up. That a democracy could only work if we see each other, because, especially in a representative democracy, it's not a true democracy. So we really have to watch each other to see each other all the time. So they saw this as like the height of democracy, surveillance, like we're going to watch each other. And I feel like during COVID, I feel this more, who's wearing a mask and they're standing too close together. Or you see kids. Exactly. Kids are playing together in the park, or did they meet up? Or, how many people are in that group? Here in the UK, we have the rule of 6. Actually, it's the rule of basically 0 now. But in Gent, for a long time, it's the rule of 6 people. And so literally, I find myself out of the corner of my eye counting 1, 2, 3. How many people are in this group, that I felt like this private surveillance machine. So I'm not saying I'll write a book about this by any stretch of the imagination, but I will at some point get Rousseau's comb and his ideas about the power of transparency into something that I write about, because I love it.
Wow, that's an I really love that story.
Yes, no, thank you. Now you see why I kept trying to put it in, and people kept telling me it was irrelevant, but I love it. Yeah.
You got a few more minutes to keep chatting?
Of course, I've got as much time as yeah.
Excellent. Does anybody want to ask a question? Those are the ones we sort of had before. Does anybody want to?
I see Bree's lovely comment about my name, which is absolutely true. There is more of a meaning to it, though. I guess the meaning is more connected to the story that's behind it. It's this really tragic story about Deirdre. But yeah, though it is true. I probably could have given my Japanese tutor a better idea of what my name really meant. It wasn't beautiful friend like hers was, though. So that sounds very nice.
You can go ahead, unmute. Feel free to unmute.
Oh, yeah.
What made you move to the UK and all? I mean, you've traveled all over. I know your mom said you've been traveling all over, and your siblings are doing a lot of different things as well.
I have come from a family, I have a big family, and we're all very different. And these in a positive way. I think they're all kind of bemused by this book as well.
Yeah, when she was young, she wanted to have 10 children.
Well, she's got 6, so I think she made her own tribe. She made her own tribe. And I'm the only one who's abroad. So my husband, who comes up in the book, is from Northern Ireland. And we've gone back and forth quite a bit. We actually met quite a long time ago. After I finished college, I had sort of a year-long fellowship in England, and we met that year, and that was 2002. So we've gone back and forth quite a bit. But he teaches at the London School of Economics. So we really came here for his job as an academic. And of course, as you do, I'm sure lots of you ended up where you are in that situation. You come for a year or two, and then, here we are 6 years later. So I imagine we'll return. In some ways, I think in terms of writing this book, it was actually really good for me to be abroad. I think I saw getting to know a new place and a new city and being disconnected and seeing someplace with a new eye, I think was actually really good for me. And I think the book is more international than it would have otherwise been.
Yeah, I think that's the really beauty of it, because you really started to see the connectedness, but also a lot of the racial unrest around the world. And I think that's one of the things also that the pandemic has gotten us to see. You know, had we not been at home to see George Floyd, we would not be talking about this, and it wouldn't have happened all over the world.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Very timely in terms of getting us to think more globally.
Yeah. Oh, that's nice way of thinking about it. Yeah. I mean, I didn't anticipate how timely some of the aspects of the book, you know, the epidemiology and the other stuff. But I mean, some of the stories, I think one of the first people I talked to actually was South African. And it was this, I had actually called her because she's basically a mapper. She's sort of a GIS expert in mapping. So my chapter in South Africa had really started out a bit like the chapter in India, about how, you know, the townships didn't have street addresses and how they were working to do this. But the reason it kind of switched a little bit was I was talking to this GIS person about the technicalities. And she said, oh, you know, a friend of mine told me this really crazy story that when he was growing up in this rural village, he had a cousin who had an address, and he said he was very glamorous. I was like, what? And he said he thought it was very glamorous that he had an address. And I thought this was very strange. So I called this guy up, and he was like, yeah, it was really glamorous. And in his village, they would actually build huts, like, you know, build their houses, and they would make up their own number, like not anything designated by anybody, because like it kind of meant that you mattered, that you had this like number on your house, even though, you know, there was no understanding. And so in some ways, a lot of the ideas of the book stem from that conversation of it not just being this technical issue, but an almost like spiritual issue, you know, about like, I want this number because I matter if I have this number. That's really interesting.
Yeah, one of the quotes that I already love is that quote by Lynn Twist, who says, "What we appreciate appreciates."
Oh, yeah.
What I got from your book, it's like, people want to be acknowledged, you know. I knew a woman who was homeless, but she was homeless, and when we stopped to give her something, she said, "Thank you for acknowledging me."
Yeah, yeah.
I didn't use it as God bless or what, but she said, "Thank you for acknowledging me." And I thought,
and I think that's a great point about mail in general. Like this came up in a lot of things that I was reading, all of these case studies that people said they really like having mail, because I think people, it's hard to imagine, but you go through your life, especially if you're on your own, and like nobody says your name and nobody knows you're there. And obviously that makes sense. But when you actually really think about it and how tragic that is, that you literally could be so completely anonymous and unseeing. We literally don't see, we're trained ourselves not to see it. So yeah, no, that's a powerful point. I saw Bree earlier as well. Is that right? Or maybe that was just the question.
Yeah,
there.
I had, if you were interested in pursuing other aspects of geography and the creation, I don't know if you're familiar with UNC Chapel Hill researcher called Carol Blair. She's done a lot of work on monuments and museums, and one of her early pieces on the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial was about the sacralization of place and how the whole design of the memorial created sort of a sacred space. So I think you'd really be interested in her.
Oh my gosh, I'd be absolutely interested. And she's just up my alley as well. Yeah, it's interesting the overlap between, and that was another thing that I hadn't really thought about, because I was always interested in the geography, but the overlap with monuments, and there's been a lot that was written about monuments recently, I think is really, really powerful. And in some ways, I always argue that I think street names are almost even more powerful, because there's so many monuments where I live and you just walk past it. In fact, my daughter recently asked, like, "Oh, what's that?" I was like, oh, I haven't a clue, you know, and we literally have lived here for years, that you don't see it, you know. But exactly, there's that point of, you know, why have we chosen to make this space, and what does it mean in the way we devise it? And the Vietnam Memorial is a great example. I will absolutely look her up. Thank you.
I have another question in the chat.
Yeah.
Is the Gent in London still working on using vacant buildings for homeless addresses? I'm fascinated with the concept. Did it work?
Yes, he's doing great. I hear from Chris every so often. You know, like, and the funny thing about Chris is really interesting as well. He's such a genuine person, because he's actually kind of a big deal architect. So he's like redesigned the National Museum of History's like whole thing, and he's really young. But absolutely, so he has a pilot program with I'm not sure how it's going through the pandemic because it was all scheduled to go through, with a borough of London called Lewisham, which is historically sort of also an immigrant, maybe one of the poor sort of councils in London. But they're all into it, and the Royal Mail is supporting him as well. So every time I hear from him, I mean, he's making progress on it. I mean, this is, I think he really has made it into a workable project.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think Chris is still going, and I think it's such a brilliant idea in such a creative design way. I love how he discussed in the book how he said, like, you know, he, like a lot of other people, wanted to do something for the homeless, but people said, don't make it more palatable for people, you know, which I thought was really powerful. Like, don't just build tents that make it okay that we have people living in this substandard, you know, that let's rethink this entirely. And I think that's what he's done. But yeah, no, he'll be happy to hear that people are asking about him, because I think he's doing. I'll email him after this because I think he's doing great. Yeah, I think they're piloting it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Any other questions from anyone?
Great.
Okay.
Great.
Well, I think we're going to have, we've only got 15 minutes left now. We're going to have a discussion. Sorry, we ran over. Sorry, I know we're only going to keep you for 30 minutes.
No. I can tell. I could just ask questions about this all the day because I think about this stuff all the time. And it's funny because when you're writing a book about street addresses, I was writing this book for years. You know, you go to a dinner party and you say, people are like, oh, so what do you do? Oh, I'm this. Oh, I'm this. Oh, what are you doing? Oh, I'm writing a book about street addresses. And people kind of slowly back away from you, right? Because you're going to be the most boring person in the room. Oh, you know, street names, well, house numbers as well. You know, you just completely tell. So I can't tell you how exciting it is to get groups like you guys who are interested in it, because for so long it sort of seemed like this sort of niche project that was very dull.
You made it interesting because I think,
thank you.
You know, you really gave the people behind it some context and some understanding. I think that's really the personal stories. I just have another question from Lionel. Sorry, it just popped up. The book was very well researched.
Oh, thanks.
How long did that take?
Oh, it took absolute ages. Thank you for saying that, Lionel, because it took absolute ages. Even though the funny thing about the research, I actually love research. Like, I love going to the British Library and getting a stack of books. And it was always great because you get to know the people there. And they're like, oh yeah, so you have a book on Korean Hangul, you know, the Civil War, you know, South Africa in the time of, you know, so people were it was always like a joke, like, what books are you going to get out this time? What am I doing? So it took quite a lot. I always say it took me about 4 years. I had two kids in the middle of this. So a lot of that was sort of like / maternity leave / thinking. So I usually say 4 years, but if I really think, so that 4 years from when I got my book contract, but at least, you know, even before the book contract, you've done a lot of thinking about it. So the Atlantic article that kind of sparked the West Virginia chapter was actually more like 6 years ago, maybe. But I wasn't at that time working on the book. It was really only in the aftermath after that book, when people kept talking to me about addresses, and I started getting more and more into the topic, that I actually saw it as a book. But I would say I usually counted about 4 years. 4 years. Nice. So it was a lot, and I was always getting distracted and calling people up, and it comes out in the book, and then finding someone and then meeting up with them or going someplace. And there's as come out, there's so much material here that I'm, I wrote an article for the history newsletter of my publisher about street names as revenge. As diplomatic revenge. It's a big thing, especially in DC, where they'll rename a street. Let's say they'll rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy after a Chinese dissident to piss them off. And then somebody will rename the street in China after some US person who pissed them off. And there's a great story about Nigeria and Nigeria and New York going back and forth, renaming streets to piss each other off. So there's a lot there. There's oceans.
So Judith said, this book has you reading random bits aloud to my family more than pages, because it was so fascinating.
Oh, that's so kind. Thank you so much, Judith. That's really kind. Yeah, no, it was the same way. It was the same way with me discovering all of this information. You know, I just didn't. It was an education in itself for me, and in some ways, it's interesting, as we started out by talking about PR people emailing me, because I'm always shocked, because, you know, I still feel like an amateur to this. I can't remember when I took a geography class. So for me, it was an education as well. I think one of the reasons why maybe it sounds so interesting is I was finding it so interesting as I was going along. And so I was constantly because the book seems to span like every country and all of time, I was constantly finding friends or academics or, kind scholars who would read what I wrote to make sure it's right, and so I was constantly like emailing a neuroscientist, but then that would be great because they would give me some extra depth into what was going on and make sure I was understanding something, and it always improved it. But I always was a student that way. I was constantly like, so what is this hippocampus? So show me where they are, and I would go to the lab and see how it was. So it really was a full education.
Yeah, there was definitely a few moments when I'd just be like, say to my husband, "Oh, did you know?" And then,
that's so nice. It's so nice. I'm still like that.
Experienced that as well. Like, oh, this country is a different country, so there's always something.
Yes.
Maybe we could just go back to, I had mentioned about how you had included a lot of people in the stories, and that's kind of what made it really kind of 3D for me anyway. I don't know about you guys.
Oh, thanks.
So can you talk to us about sort of the people you met and sort of how you made those connections and maybe, some of the more interesting characters? Because there seemed to be a whole...
Yeah, there's all sorts of characters. And one nice thing for those of you, so the reason I'm a sometime academic is that I also teach writing. So I teach, so right now I'm teaching advanced creative nonfiction, for example. So people, humans are really what connect us to the information. So, I've always found if you're trying to explain something boring, it's much better to explain it through somebody who's interesting because they can, and somebody who's passionate as well. But I always tell my students, I was like, oh, how you find people? People want to talk about the things they're interested in. I never found it hard to connect with people. You could just send them an email and say, I'm totally fascinated by this project. And they're like, come meet me for lunch or fly to Dublin or, honestly, people were so genuinely excited that somebody was interested in what they were doing, that it was actually really easy to connect with people. So a lot of the colorful characters, like Ivan Gayton's a great example. He's in the Haiti chapter. He founded the Missing Maps Project, and he's just a completely fascinating person. He's like he curses a lot. He lives all over the world. At the time when I spoke to him, in fact, I spoke to him recently again. He's living in Senegal. His wife's Japanese, and they have these it's hard to describe. I wish there were more pictures. He is like, he's white and he's got very white hair. He almost looks like a shock of white hair. And he's got these like lovely, so if you look at his Facebook page, he's got this like his Japanese children, they all have his exact shock of white hair. He's like this incredibly amazing, diligent person. But he just had these grand schemes. And so at some point in the book, I quote him as saying, he's talking about when the cholera first came and how they couldn't find them. And they at some point the road runs out and they're at the water, and he tells them, rent a fucking fishing boat. So when I was doing the fact checking for the book, I said, Ivan, like, you say fucking, do you want me to take the fucking out? He said, if I said fucking, put in fucking. I was like, okay, rent a fucking fishing boat, So I think a lot of people who do this actually are quite, I was really lucky with Nigel Baker, for example, who does the research on Gropekunt Lane. I don't think I even emphasized in the book how much of a scholar he is. He's a really brilliant archaeologist. He's done like all this big work, but the fact that he could tell me things like he was a Gropekunt Lane dilettante was just like, and he could describe. So I think I interviewed dozens more people that didn't actually make it into the book, but for people who are interested in this kind of writing, if you're also on the writing side, as I imagine a lot of people are, you'd be amazed at how many people will be so generous with their time and, you call them up, and because they work on this like kind of small, like Anton Tantner in my house numbering chapter, for example. He is the world's expert on house numbers. Do you know what it must be like to have all that knowledge and about this incredibly interesting thing and nobody ever asked you about it? So I think Anton was just like absolutely delighted that I was like, I said, well, can I come to Vienna next weekend and you can like show me around? And I think it was like the jackpot for him because he could show everybody his pet project that he'd worked on as like a very serious academic for many years.
They all seem so passionate, I think maybe that's
they are. They are, exactly. And I think the passion, and I think that really excited me as well. Like I wouldn't have thought about a lot of these issues the same way if I didn't have all of these like passionate guides who like, just really cared about all of these things. And, not everybody I even met. So Susan Hiller, for example, who's the the conceptual artist who's in the Berlin chapter. I kept bugging her to meet her. I really wanted to interview her, and she's in London, but she's a very private person. So she sent me the film, and we went back and forth a little bit, but not much. So I ended up using a lot of the material from books she'd written, but also she's given a lot of public lectures that are available. So I watched a lot of the public lectures. So even though I didn't really interview with her, like I felt like I knew her because I'd read so much of her work. Her son actually emailed me recently because he'd read the book. And then she actually passed, she actually died shortly before the book was published, as did Benjamin Israel, who's in the Confederacy chapter, he died shortly after the book as well. And so for me, it's lovely that I kind of got to know all these people, you know, even though some of them I never met. Benjamin Israel I talked on the phone with quite a bit, but
that's kind of the modern age, isn't it? Is knowing people without meeting them.
Yeah.
David asked if you could post a link to the revenge piece.
Yes. I'm not even sure. It's in
if you can always send it to me later, and I can send it.
I might have to send it to you later. It's in something called the History Reader, I think. Yeah, I can send it to you. I can even send you the Word doc that I sent before. Yeah, it's really interesting issue, and it comes up all the time. In fact, at the start of the pandemic, for example, there was a group of Republican senators, I think Marco Rubio, Liz Cheney, a few others, who've put a bill in to change the name of the Chinese embassy to, I'm blanking on his name, the name of the doctor in China who first suspected that COVID-19, and then he was later reprimanded and he later died. So they had this big thing to do that. That was eventually shot down, but that's sort of how I open it. And then China got really mad, and they've already changed one of the street names in front of the Russian embassy to a Russian dissident who was killed. So, and Manhattan did this as well. Yeah.
Right. So Deirdre, the reason that I asked for that, when you were talking about the revenge, renaming of streets, I mentioned this last week or 2 weeks ago. I don't remember which meeting of the book club. I was in Strasbourg, France, several years ago, and one thing that really struck me, it was controlled by the French up until 1871, and the Germans, and then the French again. And the Germans went around during the Second Empire and basically chiseled German names into, like the Opera House or the University.
Yes. Wow.
And then, chiseled street names into the buildings, like, Kaiser Wilhelmstrasse and so forth.
Yes.
And then the French, after 1918 and 1945, went in and renamed all the streets after, like General Leclerc, or, the date on which the city was liberated from the Nazis. And I remember just walking around Strasbourg, just thinking about how these layers of history sort of competed for, naming rights. It was,
I know.
That's the spirit in which I.
Oh my gosh! I wish I'd known about that before. That's totally fascinating. Yeah, you're exactly right. You've put it perfectly. All this history fought over it. And there's a quote in the book from Milan Kundera, the novelist. He says, "This is what we're fighting over. How to what people really want is a way of defining the past. It's not really about the future. It's like who has the power of defining the past." Which reminds me of something else that didn't make it into the book, but I always want to write about. Which is, there's this really interesting scholar who writes about Hawaii and street names in Hawaii, which is a really interesting story of power, which is this idea that when, for lack of a better word, settler colonists basically first came to Hawaii, they very consciously named Hawaii after, using Western English sounding names. But the less power the native Hawaiians got, the more they were sort of, pushed out, and the more power the colonists got, the more likely they were to change the names to Hawaiian names. So now in Hawaii, you have a lot of Hawaiian names because once people aren't a threat anymore, we're inclined to name things after them. So this happens with Native American names in the US. So actually, it's an interesting story. I believe there's an article about this, which I can send Kim, which is about buffalo. That buffalo, there was some scholar who researched that the more Native Americans were pushed out, the more streets became named after Native Americans, because then it becomes not a threat and it becomes kind of romantic, right? Like, you think of it, these names, these Hawaiian names, these native names are quite romantic sounding, but they're only romantic after people actually aren't going to kill you, after you aren't actually in a murderous battle with them. So you get this in Hawaii now it's become to the point that Native Hawaiians actually get really upset at the renaming of really fancy, expensive buildings with Hawaiian names, because to them it's a bit of a slap in the face, because it's no longer their land or their property or their money, but they're borrowing. Yes, but so in some ways, I think a lot of these people are actually quite well-meaning and wanting to name things local names, but they actually become a bit of an affront. And I make this argument in something else I've written, but I haven't published about, actually, this is another New York story. So, as I open the book, New York has all of these, honorary street names. And one of the honorary street names they have in Bed-Stuy is after the notorious B.I.G. I think I mentioned that in the book. One argument I make in relation to this Native Hawaiian argument is that Notorious B.I.G. Street, when it happened, all the local officials were like, finally, we're getting credit, for people who know about Bed-Stuy. It's been, often largely gentrified. It's really changed as a neighborhood. It's become very expensive and very glamorous and gentrified. And so they're saying, isn't it great how we're honoring, this native Bed-Stuy hero on the street names? Like, this is a great thing. I actually argue that maybe it makes the opposite point, that when at a time when B.I.G. was doing what he was doing, and actually, if you listen to the lyrics, he was a drug dealer. A lot of things he was advocating were the things people were scared of in Bed-Stuy. That it wouldn't have been possible to name a street Notorious B.I.G. Street. It was just but the fact that it was so easy now is a bit like Hawaii. It's a bit romantic that B.I.G. in this old crack-ridden neighborhood, but now it's, you can live there. It's kind of safe. Like there's some resonance for me between those two stories, that we name things after things when they're no longer a threat to us. And B.I.G. and crack addicts and crack dealerships, well, to a much lesser extent, are not the threat to Bed-Stuy that they were 20 years ago.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Similarly, but obviously a less important point is that that romanticization of naming after things that have been displaced applies to flowers and animals and trees.
Exactly.
As well as, it's more important to think about the political dimensions, but Deer Run Park usually is completely developed.
Exactly. We cut it down. We name it after the things that were there. I remember there was a subdivision where I lived that was called like Turkey Farmer, and we always loved that because it's so cool there was a turkey farm there, but like there's no turkey farm there. It's all sort of identikit suburban houses. But obviously people like the romanticism that there was a turkey farm there, but it's no longer a place that turkey farm could exist. So it's ironic. Yeah.
So unfortunately, I think we're sort of ending.
Yes. No, and I took up all your time, but
no, it's okay. I don't know, David, if you want to kind of say anything about, we could sort of have a quick chat about wrapping up the book or anything, or we have Deirdre here. If you could, we were doing the last 3 chapters, so it's kind of quite a lot.
Oh, right. Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But we seem to have run out of time. So
I think I think it's great that you're ending on that note. I think if I've gotten any critiques when I do groups like this, people are like, oh, it ends too ambivalently, but I think in some ways the ambivalence of that last chapter is just basically how I feel, is how I feel about it. But I think the last line of the book is people, these 18th century Europeans knew more than we know about why it's so important to name and why these names and street names matter. And the last line is, do we? And so I think what the book is aiming to do is just make you think about it differently. And I'm really not trying, for the most part, to push people in any directions. But I think the first step is just thinking about it. And if that happens, then the book's been a great success. So yeah.
Like you said, kind of noticing.
Just noticing. I think is the first step towards a lot of these urban planning issues, which I know you guys are so involved with. Just opening your eyes and seeing it. Yeah.
I loved the phrasing you used. What did you say?
I think that after reading the book, what struck me was when I came to the end of it, and the understanding that naming is not neutral.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's something behind it.
Yes.
There's something that that is hurtful or something that is positive. I really like the story of Melvin in St. Louis. That really got
a good story.
He's great. I followed Melvin for a long time. He was one of the very first things I wrote, and he's never strayed from his mission, even if he hasn't had always the success. But that's not neutral. And the interesting thing, and I know you guys are going, but even in the Confederate street names about the neutral, people, when they wanted to change it from General Lee name, people would say, let's just number the streets. But people actually didn't want that. They wanted it to mean something, right? Well, I think numbered streets mean something, but you know what I mean. So they were always pushing for something that meant something, which I think really exemplifies exactly the point you're making, Jacqueline, that like, you know, it's just not neutral and people don't want it to be neutral. And I think it's a good thing it's not neutral. I don't have any problem with that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all.
Before, so you know, you've just put me.
Oh, great. Oh, I'm so pleased. I'm so pleased. And thank you guys so much for inviting me. And Deborah, thank you for coming as well. I'm going to call my mother. She's on speed dial as soon as I do. She'll be so delighted. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
great.
Thank you for joining us. I mean, it was so great for you to come and you know, let us chat with you about stuff, and you know, we all really enjoyed your book.
Oh, I'm so pleased. And my emails on my website. I love hearing from people. So send me your address stories, and thank you so much again.
I mean, yeah, because even the other day I saw something and I wanted to send it to you. The thing.
Oh my gosh! By all means, by all means. Oh my gosh, I get those are like my best emails. Like I love doing that. So absolutely, send it to me.
Yeah, no,
excellent.
Oh, great.
A lot of food for thought. I think. Need to understand the connections, and it really made me want to know more about my surroundings.
Yeah. Well, then the book's been a great success if that's true. That's really what I wanted for it, for people to just.
I think that's the important. So, and also the connectedness, and I think we need to understand we really are connected.
Yeah.
And all this disconnection that we're seeing.
Exactly. If we were just transparent.
Yeah.
Exactly. If they could just see that he didn't break the comb.
That's right. I mean, really, it was amazing.
Yeah. I'm so pleased. Thank you so much.
I think I remember the quote that I was trying to find a minute ago. It's probably a nice thing to end on was that you said that addresses, or you were quoting that someone said addresses were invisible architecture, which perfect. You know,
exactly. And we never think about it. I certainly hadn't before I got into this. So.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Deirdre.
Thank you. Okay, bye everyone. Thanks again, Kim. Thanks.
And
thank you
for leading our previous sessions, and to everybody reading
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for choosing it. Okay, bye. Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Absolutely.
Bye, everyone.